Last time I tackled the foundations and got the timber frame in place. This time I'll be installing the Soakaway, adding insulation and laying the subfloor. Let's get straight into it. It may seem early, but now is the best time to think about drainage. For us, we don't have any house drainage that we can tap into, but given we only need to worry about rainwater, our best option is going to be a soakaway. This is essentially a big hole in the ground that can absorb and dissipate the water. There are many soakaway size calculators online, but I ended up using this simplified table. Since our roof is only going to be around 15 meters squared, I did some maths and figured I needed a 0.3 meters square soakaway. I then hand dug this hole, which was a lot less fun than I thought it would be, before installing this soakaway crate. These crates are designed to be strong enough for a car to drive over them while having a large internal volume. This one has a void of 0.2 meters squared. I wrapped the crate in a permeable membrane to stop any dirt ingress over time. Then at the garden room end, I buried a bottle gully where I knew the downpipe would be, then ran a 110mm pipe between the gully and the soakaway. As I still needed more volume, I added rubble to the hole from the old greenhouse foundations that used to be in this space, and again wrapped it all in the membrane. In hindsight, I think I probably should have fitted a larger soakaway, as this one will only just achieve the recommended volume. Having said that, I suspect the recommendations have a large margin for error, but for peace of mind, I would have preferred to have gone bigger. Getting back to the frame, my next job was to tackle the insulation. Although we don't need to worry about building standards, it's a good place to start when getting a sense of how much insulation to use. Unfortunately, I couldn't find these regulations written up in a user-friendly format, so it's hard to be certain I'm providing the correct figures. But the Scottish regulations, which are a little easier to interpret, state that the U value for the walls, floor and roof should be the following. With U values, the important thing to remember is the lower the number, the better. If I go over to Celatex's U-value calculator for the floor, that equates to an insulation thickness of 150mm. As a reminder, I have 120mm deep joists, so clearly 150mm isn't even possible, and I can assure you that no off-the-shelf garden room is providing that much insulation. When I consider our house, which is generally a warm house, doesn't have any insulation under the floor, this really puts things into context. For budgetary reasons, and because I think it's still plenty, I opted to use 70mm thick insulation. This only achieves a U value of 0.31, but I'm not worried, I think it's going to be a plenty warm room. To support the insulation, I use 50 by 25mm timber, which is typically used for battening. That means it's cheap, and conveniently the 70mm insulation plus the 50mm batten equals the depth of the joists. After cutting them all to length, I simply aligned them with the bottom of the joists and nailed them in place. As you can see, I've also been busy running power and network cables to the structure, as well as putting in a weed membrane and gravel all round. With the gravel, the frame is exactly 50mm off the ground. This provides the necessary air gap without eating too far into the 2.5 meter height limit allowed under the permitted development regulations. This is when all my planning started to come together. Because of the way I designed the frame and because I used a spacer block to ensure all the joists are perfectly positioned, I'm able to batch cut all my insulation at the table saw. I did do a few tests to confirm I had the perfect fit, but once I had it dialed in, I could file them all through the saw. If any of you have ever cut insulation and witnessed the mess it makes, or how frustrating it can be to cut each piece to a different size, you'll appreciate how satisfying this was. And with them cut to width, I just had to cut them down to length and tap them into position. This is just about the perfect fit, tight enough that air isn't going to get past, but not so tight that it gets damaged when it's pushed into place. For the areas that had a post, I lined everything up and used a post offcut as a template. I could then score the foil with a knife and cut it out with a handsaw. I was very pleased with how everything fitted together, but I still needed to use expanding foam to fill a few gaps. The best tip I can give you with expanding foam is to use a foam gun. You get much better control, but you also seem to get 2 or 3 times more out of a can. I know that seems unlikely, but it's consistently been my experience. Another good tip with the gun is to leave the bottle permanently fixed to it and store it bottle side down. If you do this, the gun should last for a good while. If on the other hand you try to clean it out, like I did for the first few guns, you'll almost certainly find it clogs up. Also, if any foam falls on the floor, avoid the temptation to clean it up. Just let it cure, then once it's hardened you'll find it easy to pick up. Next, me and Dora applied foil tape to all the seams, making sure not to just cover the seams between the insulation, but also the seams at the post and the timbers. This is a really important step in preventing air movement. This next part is a little controversial and I haven't been able to find definitive guidance about it. As you can see here, I'm laying a damp-proof membrane that would be sandwiched between the insulation and the subfloor. I'll cover this topic in more detail in a later video, but the crux of it is you don't want the warm, humid air to migrate to the cold areas where it can condensate and cause damp. That in a nutshell is why buildings need a vapor control layer on the warm side of the structure. My uncertainty is if a vapor control layer should be used on a suspended timber floor. The logic of why there should be a layer remains true whether it be the ceiling, walls or floor, but there are several practicalities which conflict with this logic. The reality is that the majority of the warm air will be inclined to escape upwards rather than downwards. Additionally, and more importantly though, during construction the subfloor will be exposed to the elements, and any rain that falls will become trapped between that vapor control layer and the subfloor. The same is true if anything's ever spilt on the floor. If I chose to have a vapor control layer, I would install it like this and wrap it around the floor and up the walls. This would provide a perfect airtight seal. But long story short, I've decided not to include this layer. Since the room will be used as an office, humidity will be minimal. If it were used as a gym or a sauna, I might reconsider. Also, I'm building this in September, and once this stage of the project is finished, I'm going to pause the project until nicer weather next year. That means that although I'm going to protect everything, it's still going to have to endure a long winter exposed to the elements. All in all, I think the structure will be happier and healthier without the membrane. The next job is the subfloor. I'm using 18mm thick OSB 3, which is an external and structural grade of OSB. It's basically intended for this purpose and it's much more cost effective than the plywood equivalent. I have seen other builds where they choose to use plywood as they like the look for the finished floor, but if you do use plywood, be sure that you're sourcing external and structural grade plywood, and also be sure that the exterior veneer is thick enough. Often the nicer looking plywoods only have paper thin veneer on the outside. Since the base frame is symmetrical, it makes sense to start from the middle. I put the first board in place and then secure it down. You'll want to use screws here as nails can lead to a squeaky floor. Obviously, the floor is going to be a structural part, but not just to support the weight of things placed on it. It also keeps the frame held square and evens out the forces across the structure. That means a lot of screws are required to transfer those forces. Once again, it's hard to find a definitive guide how many fixings to use, but I place a screw every 150mm around the edges and 300mm in the middle, which is on the upper end of how many fixings are generally advised. It's probably overkill for a building like this, but one of the nice things about building for yourself is you can be a bit indulgent and know that you've got a rock solid build. To help space the screws, I use this scrap bit of wood with a mark every 150mm. Between each board, it's important to leave a 3mm expansion gap. I put a shim between each board as I pull them together to maintain this gap. It isn't a huge problem on a building this size, but as you can imagine on a larger building, these 3mm gaps do start to add up and cause the OSB sheets to get out of alignment with the stud work. For this reason, you can commonly source sheets that are 3mm shorter across the length and width. That's what I purchased across this build, and it does really help. For the last board, I was careful to run my power and network cables through it. I measured this up very carefully as I wanted to make sure my cables ran up through the stud work rather than awkwardly into the room. I won't go into too much details about the wiring because I'm not an electrician and I don't want to mislead you. But if you do intend to use your garden room as an office, it is a really good idea to bring in a network cable as well as power. On that, make sure that the network cable is never too close to the power cable as it can cause interference. And that's the foundations and base frame complete. In the next video I'll start to put up the walls, but as I said earlier, first I'm going to put this project on hold for the winter. With building on my own and filming, this project takes much longer than it otherwise would, so winter isn't a good time for me. The good news for you though is in real time it's already spring and I'm back to work, so the next installment should only be in a few weeks' time. Until then, cheerio!